relationship. If one person is doing all these things and not setting boundaries and not recharging and being healthy, the other person is going to start to see that person who's the doormat feeling less and less towards them, and it could lead to bigger marital problems because they don't respect that person, because they don't say no to anybody, they don't protect themselves.
Welcome to the Restore Go podcast, where we discover ways to restore our relationship with God and others. Now, here are your co-hosts, Biblical Therapist Pete Thompson and Biblical Coach Lynne Thompson. Together, let's learn how to restore go.
Welcome to Restore Go. I'm Biblical Therapist Pete Thompson.
And I'm Biblical Coach Lynne Thompson. And today on the Restore Go podcast, we are going to talk about boundaries. So in 1992, two authors, which were clinical psychologists Henry Cloud and John Townsend, co-authored a book titled Boundaries: When to Say Yes, How to Say No to Take Control of Your Life. Well, it became a New York Times bestseller and is widely recognized as a Christian self-help text that integrates biblical principles with psychological concepts, especially when it comes to boundaries. You know, with millions of copies sold, this hit a nerve in the Christian community, in the Christian church, so its influence can't be overstated. It helped bring a spotlight to something that many people struggle with: boundaries. Pete, many of your clients deal with boundary issues. Can you first describe, how would you define boundaries?
Boundaries are being able to set a limit when somebody is asking a question or asking for something that might be considered unreasonable.
Okay, so unreasonable according to who?
Probably to the hearer. An example might be where you've done something for somebody and you've gone out of your way to do it, and now they're expecting you to do it all the time.
Okay, so kind of taking advantage of you.
Yeah. And so we do things, we sacrifice for our brothers and sisters in Christ, and that is part of being a believer. But if a person is expecting that you're going to do it all the time, not really giving you an option to say yes or no, but just expecting it, that's when you have to set a boundary with them that, yeah, I can do it next week, but I can't do it this week. And how they respond to that will say a lot.
So why is it so difficult to set boundaries for us? What about us makes us feel maybe almost guilty?
Well, we're taught as believers and all through Scripture that we sacrifice for other people, and part of that's the how to love your neighbor as yourself, is you sacrifice for them. But there's a limit to that in how much you sacrifice. If you're doing it all the time and the person is now expecting it as part of their routine, and it starts draining you to the extent that now, you're loving them, but you're not loving yourself and also protecting yourself, that's where it can become a problem.
So why is it important to set these healthy boundaries? Like, what is the downside of, I'm going to say yes all the time. I'm going to be this loving person. I'm going to always be there for them. There's a downside to that, right?
Yeah, because what happens when you don't set boundaries on people, your life becomes very chaotic. You're always at the whim of somebody else's crisis. And we used to have a saying at my office: your poor planning is not my crisis. And so when you set boundaries, you're setting up order and you're expecting the people to plan and take care of things. If they're always in crisis, it means they're not being responsible for the stuff that they need to do, and that's bleeding into your life and causing chaos, anxiety, and stress in your life because you're trying to manage, your responsibilities. And now you've got a person that's dumping their stuff on you that's really making your life more unmanageable.
So you're kind of encouraging their bad behavior.
Exactly, by not setting boundaries. It's okay to help out. It's like if I see a family on the side of the road that, will work for food or whatever, I see them in a bad place and I say, they say they're hungry, I will say, hey, I'll take you over to this local restaurant, fast food or whatever, and I'll get you anything you want within reason, and so that your stomachs are full. And if they say, oh, that would be so wonderful, we really appreciate it, I know I'm meeting a need. But if I say, hey, I'll take you over to the restaurant and buy you and your kids anything you need so that your stomachs are full, and they say, well, we're not really hungry right now, if you could just give us the money, setting a boundary is like, well, since you're not hungry now, I'm really not interested in giving you cash because there's potential abuse with me giving you cash. And we can name all those things, but that is a whole other talk itself.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I totally agree because like you said, you're kind of encouraging the bad behavior, the bad decisions, and you're wanting to love your neighbor as yourself. And so loving your neighbor isn't encouraging them in their bad decisions.
Yeah. And then causing your life to be crazy because they're not planning and taking control of their lives.
Right. Well, some people will get frustrated with that whole situation, not just that one, but other boundary situations. And they basically shut down and they build walls. Not boundaries. They build walls. And they're like, yeah, I'm not doing anything for anybody anytime because I don't like setting boundaries or I don't know how or I feel. And so they'll just build walls against people. But that's not necessarily a healthy decision either, right?
Well, how do you make disciples of all the nations if you've built walls around your interaction with people?
It's true.
And so we're supposed to interact with people and we're supposed to be a blessing and we're supposed to mirror Christ to people. And you can't do that if you're building walls. And so it's really a better idea to learn how to set reasonable boundaries and be okay with the reasonable boundaries rather than feeling guilty if you don't give a person everything that they want exactly when they want it.
I remember this time when Jesus was in the corner square, in the square, right? And people, the Pharisees were coming up to him, right? And they're like, we'd like you to answer us this question. And he's like, okay, well, first I want you to answer my question and then I'll answer your question. So he was setting a boundary. Mm-hmm. He's like, okay, I'm going to ask you a question. And then, of course, he said, do you believe John was from the Lord, basically?
Yeah.
And so he's got him in a catch-22 because if they say, we don't think, John the Baptist was a prophet, then all the people are going to turn against him. If they say he was, well, then why are you not following him? And so Jesus sets this boundary and they don't want to play that game. They are like, yeah, we really had bad intentions and that's why we're asking. We really didn't want the answer. And that's what he knew. Jesus knew that. So he was kind of calling them, sort of like you're describing with that family incidents you just said. You really want to get to the real motives of why people are asking for something in the first place. Like, what's their motive? Is your motive to take advantage of people? Is your motive to get money to go get, into some addictive behavior? What is your reasoning?
Well, sometimes the motive is, I really haven't planned well in my life. And maybe it's a little bit of laziness or distraction or other things. And so now I'm behind the 8 ball. And so I really need you, my Christian brother or sister, to bail me out. And so that's why when a person continues to ask you to do things for them, and it's probably an area that they're not accepting responsibility for their own mistakes or their own poor planning. And so giving in to them, it's hurting you as the individual helping, but it's also hurting the one you're helping because they're not changing.
Yeah.
Because sometimes God uses the consequences of problems to teach us, yeah, Pete, you can't keep doing that because you're unloading your responsibility onto other people. And originally, when I saw the need, this was probably about 15 years ago, I worked at 3 medical offices, and I had a bunch of clients, female clients, come in, and their lives were chaotic. It was stressful. It was frustrating. They didn't know which way was up, and they were getting depressed. And so as they were telling me about their life, I noticed that they weren't setting boundaries, and in their family, they weren't allowed to set boundaries. They were the fixer and the take responsibility for everybody's life in the family. And as a result, everybody was kind of, having an easy life. But these mothers, their lives were chaos because they were expected to take responsibility for everybody else's shortcomings.
Yeah, you mentioned family. So we are allowed to set boundaries then with our spouse, right?
Yes.
I mean, is that allowed?
No, not with you.
There's got to be a healthy way to set boundaries with your spouse sometimes, right?
Yeah, and you talk about, hey, I'm going to help you this time, but I really need you. I'll show you how to do this activity, or I'll show you how to do this task, so it's not falling on me, because I can't be here and do this and do the other responsibilities. And because we work together, there's certain things that you set boundaries on me on things, and there's certain things I set boundaries with you, just so that we can get everything we need done in the day.
Yeah. Well, it's the 100% for both, right?
Yes.
It's not this 50-50
No.
relationship where you're like, okay, you do this and I do that and you do. This is what needs to happen for life to work. And so how can we get that done?
And sometimes the task that you or I are doing is done quicker than we planned. And so now we've got time to kind of step in. And if we see the other person is behind schedule, then it's like, hey, is there something I can take off your list that will make you be able to function better? And that's the loving thing that we do in families. But it's not, well, you're going to do this for me, you're going to do this for me, you're going to do this for me. And that's not going to work. It has to be flexible.
Yeah, and I love that you said it's a discussion. So it's not like a yelling. It's not a you don't do, I don't do, whatever. It's this discussion that it's like, hey, this is what I have on my plate. I don't see how I'm going to get it all done. Is there any way you could take any one of these things off my plate? Hey friends, let's be honest. It can be difficult, if not impossible, to find a Christian therapist that's true to your values. Pete Thompson knows that. As a licensed therapist, he is committed to providing godly counsel, introducing helpful tools, battling everyday problems like anxiety, addictions, as well as marriage and parenting challenges. Give Pete a call to set up your next confidential appointment online or in the office. Visit PeteThompson.org. Again, that's PeteThompson.org.
And it's not a guilt-motivated thing where we come up and, you never help me in this, and I'm always doing this. And so that's always has to set a boundary on that. And so because we love each other, couples love each other, and so we have to be reasonable with one another.
Well, and you have that list, and, what's the worst thing that can happen? You don't get help on that list. Something falls by the wayside. It just does. And, it's like, well, why didn't this get done? I couldn't get it done. There were too many things on my list, and I don't mean that in a coy way. I just mean that's reality. I want to get it done. I used to say to you, the dishes wouldn't be done. And I go, I really want them to be done. I really want to get them done. And he would say, I know, but you really didn't have time to get them done. So I'm going to do them. So, and I'm like, no, I'll do them. And you're like, nope, nope, nope. And you would just do them for me. So we see each other, and there's things that I'm better at, you're better at. we default to that because, I'm not going to work that sprinkler system thing correctly, no matter how hard I try. Other than the on and off button, I really don't get it. And so, there's things that my paperwork, some of the stuff I do for our business, I do that. It's easy for me. It's not easy for you. And so we've learned each other's strengths and weaknesses and how to boister, is that the word? Each other up.
Lift each other up.
Yeah, in areas that we're good at and encourage each other. But to grab those areas that either one of us could do, whether it's take out the trash or whatever. When we had the kids, it was, can you pick them up? Kind of whoever picks them up because it's a situational.
Yeah, and the other person might make dinner.
Right, exactly. So that being said, staying with the family theme, so our children, can we set boundaries with our children, and how does that happen? You have kind of a funny story about if you can't get stuff done because you're too tired, that funny story you tell.
Oh, yeah. So, a lot of times, once, your kids are really sweet and they're special until about 12 years old. And then somebody takes your kids and they
it's an
replace
invasion
them.
of the body snatchers.
Yeah, they change them out to this child that questions and challenges everything now, and we know that's part of the growing process, but it's like toddlerhood revisited. The difficult of the terrible twos comes back.
The difference is you can't pick them up and physically make them do stuff.
Or put them back behind the gate in their room. They'll follow you around the house and continue to ask why. And so it always came about to doing chores. And so we would assign each of our kids chores and expect them to do it. And when they said, well, I don't have time to do it, or I don't want to do it, or I don't think I should have to do it. And so I would just, you're right. That might be unreasonable. So either I do it or mom does it, but just know when we're tired and you want to go somewhere and you need a ride somewhere, if we're tired because we've been doing your chores, we really don't have the energy to take you anywhere because we're exhausted. And so we would say that to our kids, and they'd figure out that they had to do it. But it was a couple times. It was very funny. We said that, yeah, we'll do it, but we'll probably be tired at the most inopportune moment as far as something that you want. I think it took half an hour for our kids to figure out, wait a minute, they're going to be tired when I need to go to my slumber party at my friend's house or want to go to an outing with my friends. And so finally they said, no, I'll do it. They, before we had a chance to do that chore that needed to be done, they amazingly came up with the energy to do that task. But that was an important boundary that we set, because if we didn't set that boundary, not only would we have been tired because doing the chore, but then we would be tired and having to take and haul them around places.
Right. It's just too much. And they learn that your parents only have a certain amount of energy, and I still remember one of our children, if you would have had me when you were younger, you would have had way more energy. I said, yes, but I wouldn't have been as smart. Parent smart.
Yeah.
That's what you want to do.
Yeah.
I even remember, as younger children, we had our children on our allowance. And, we just said, we're Thompsons, we're just going to share what we have as far as extra. And, and they got a certain amount. But, we'd said also being part of a Thompson is that you have to have chores and things that we do as a family. So, it'd be like, okay, well, this week, you're in charge of dishes. And so I'd be like, okay, dishes need to be done. Oh, I don't want to do them. Oh, okay. Well, I'll do them. Oh, you will? Yeah. I am going to charge you because, now it's not my chore this week to do that. But, you just, since you're giving up the responsibility, you need to hire someone to do it. It has to get done. So I'll just charge you. And then they found out how much I was charging them. And they're like, no, I'll do it.
And we weren't even charging them union labor rates, but to them, it felt like it because it was an exorbitant to them.
It was too much. So here's a more complicated one. Boundaries, and you'll hear this a lot in couples that we see in the office, boundaries with in-laws, right? With our own parents and with our in-laws. Setting those boundaries can be kind of tricky because you're trying to maintain a good relationship with the in-laws, but at the same time, if you don't set those boundaries, then it starts to compromise your own relationship with your husband or wife.
Yeah. And depending on whose parents they are, that's the adult is going to set the boundaries with them. And
What does that mean?
So you and your spouse will talk about what needs to change, and you'll come to the conclusion of what needs to happen that both you and your spouse can agree on. And then depending on whose parents they are.
Oh, yeah, because then the wife is talking to her own parents.
Yes.
And the husband is talking to his own parents.
Yeah, because if the husband sets boundaries on the wife's parents, they'll forgive the wife for telling him no, but they probably will never forgive the son-in-law for telling them no.
That's true. That's true.
But it's something that you and your spouse decide on what is best for our family, or what are the continued problems if we continue to not set boundaries in this area. What is this doing to our family? And so that starts the process. The other thing that starts the process is when you're feeling like you're being taken advantage of, a little bit of anger usually is what's needed to start the conversation about setting boundaries. When you feel like you might have been burned by the expectations of the in-laws being too much, or your parents being too much, being a little bit frustrated with that usually makes it easier to get the energy forth to set the boundaries.
Well, yeah. I mean, you're not going off on people.
No, you're not going up. But that starts the, hey, wait a minute, we're doing this again, and we're doing this again. Hey, this doesn't feel right. I'm starting to not feel good about this. And that starts the conversation with you and your spouse about a change that needs to happen. Yeah,
that totally makes sense. Because, if it's like, this isn't working, then we need to sit down together as a couple and say, okay, what will work? Because we both want to honor our parents. It's not that we don't want to honor them, but how do we make that work in a way that isn't totally draining us or, causing division or whatever it is?
Because we will make sacrifices for our parents, especially the older they get. We have to make greater sacrifice, just like they made sacrifices when we were very young and we needed protection. They need protection as they get older. But there are some boundaries so that you can be there for when they really need you, but there's still things that you can have them do so you're not overwhelmed.
Right, that totally makes sense. So what happens when a person has literally, you hear these people, I don't have boundaries, you'll many times hear people say, oh, I feel like a doormat. It's almost this woe is me. And, there's a part of me that wonders, are you inviting your own problem because you're not setting any boundaries and you are being a doormat?
Well, usually it gets down to a negative self-worth. And so much of the culture talks about self-esteem and you got to raise your self-esteem. But it's better to look at it biblically that God loves us and he sees the value in us. So for a Christian to think, well, I have no value, so I have to do all these things for somebody so that I will have value, is a really bad understanding of who we are in Christ. And so if we don't feel good about ourselves, then we feel we have to do all these extra things. We have to do extra things for our spouses. We have to work extra hard at work because we're not sure that we're a good employee or we're valued by the company. So we put in extra time and we really drain ourselves out because we don't have a realistic view of how Jesus sees us.
That's so good because, like you said, our identity is in Christ.
Yes.
But for the person who's the doormat, their identity is in being a doormat. Like, that's how they see themselves. That's how they get their value. This is who they define themselves to be. And so now they're not living up to who Christ has called them to be, because their identity is to be in Christ, doing the works that he's called them to do, which might not be the works that everybody else is calling them to do.
Yeah, because somebody who views himself as a doormat and other people are going to gravitate to them and dump their responsibility onto that person. And eventually that person is going to be, why is life so difficult? Why am I stressed out? Why can I never take a break? Why is my blood pressure up? And people will start to have medical problems, heart problems, because we weren't designed to live that way as a doormat. We were designed to have value and to use our gifts and our special talents to be a blessing, but not to be the worm that I am or anything like that.
Well, it's the need to recharge.
Yes.
And yeah.
Because, once a battery is drained and sitting really low, it really has no use for anything until it takes time to recharge, because we all have talents and abilities. And when we recharge and get rest, we're able to take our skills and our talents and use them where they can be used best. But if we're always on 20% or 30% of our energy level because we're just constantly doing and we don't see the need to rest, that's very problematic.
Right, exactly. Well, yeah, because you quickly think, oh, I'm depressed or I'm anxious, and it might not be, that might be just the outcome of you not setting boundaries.
Well, yeah, and it also has an impact on the marital relationship. If one person is doing all these things and not setting boundaries and not recharging and being healthy, the other person is going to start to see that person who's the doormat feeling less and less towards them, and it could lead to bigger marital problems because they don't respect that person, because they don't say no to anybody, they don't protect themselves. And so that's an important idea to think about.
I remember one of the things that you talk about is the power of the no. Like, you really don't know what type of relationship you have with someone until you tell them no.
Yes.
Talk about that.
Oh, that was a really interesting tool, because when you set a boundary, a reasonable boundary on somebody, and you listen for the next 15 to 20 seconds, you know exactly how they see you. It tells you who they are, it tells you how they see you and your value to them. If you set a reasonable boundary and they say, hey, that totally makes sense. You've been doing a lot. I need to find another way to take care of that. That is a person that is to be valued. That's a person that you want to help out in the future because they have realistic expectations of you. And so that's a relationship to keep. And I used to call them number 2 friends. The ones where you say no to people, you have to say no a reasonable.
Wait, who was the number 1 friend?
I'm going to explain the number
okay.
1 friend. So the number 1 friends are when you say no to them, they complain, they say you never help me, you're not going to be there for me, they manipulate, they cajole, they do all kinds of stuff, and you've helped them many times, and they're still demanding more and more, and how can't you do that? I thought you were Christian. Christians do that. And so that's what I call a number 1 friend. And a number 1 friend is all about number 1.
They're number 1.
And so
you're not number 1, they're number 1.
And so if you find that you're spending a lot of time with number 1 people, which is, it's all about them and their needs in the moment. And when you have a need, those number 1 friends are always busy. They're nowhere to be found.
I have met those kind of people.
But the number 2 friends, they're always willing to help you, and as you're asking them reasonable requests. And so this is what I would always tell my clients: be very attentive to the difference between number 1 and number 2 people, because you don't want to have a lot of number 1 friends. When a number 1 friend will continue to ask you, that's the time where you say, I'd really love to help you, but I really have to wash my cat tonight. And I know that's an absurd example, but it's kind of the humor that it's like, no, I don't have to drain myself out for this person.
Right. Well, you do. You meet those people that say, hey, can you help me out? And you help them out. And then they say something like, hey, if you ever need anything, just let me know. And you're like, oh, okay. Well, then something comes up. You're like, hey, can you help me out? No, not a good time. You're like, okay. You kind of go, well, yeah, probably wasn't a good time for them. I totally get that. You're respecting their no.
Yeah.
And then you ask them again and they're still busy. And then you ask them again and they're still busy.
And then they come and ask you later, can you help me out?
Yeah. Then they want your help again.
And so that just classifies, because there's no thought, hey, I need to help this person's helped me out 3 times and I've always been too busy, and it just doesn't click with them. Something it's broken. It doesn't click, but they feel they can keep asking, but they don't have to be there for anybody else.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. You learn a lot about
When
the
you
number
say,
1 friend and the number 2 friend.
and so it all opens up. Now, you don't want to make up foolish things of why you can't help, but when you truly can't help, you're setting a reasonable boundary. Pay very attention to how they respond, the body language, the facial expressions, everything, because that's what you need to know. Because the number 1 friends, you eventually have to be too busy for your number 1 friends, but you're never too busy for your number 2 friends.
Well, and the number 2 friend is someone that you go to them and you ask them for help. And if it is possible in their situation, their life, their schedule, they're saying, yeah, totally, I'll be there for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you, like you said, you don't want to take advantage of number 2 friends because they're actually genuine and they're there for you.
Yeah. You want to respect them and understand that they have lives too.
I was looking at Matthew 22:36 through 40. It says, they were asking Jesus, teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments depend the whole law and the prophets. And I was just thinking of the love your neighbor as yourself. And, I've seen it both ways where you're not loving your neighbor as yourself. You're being the number 1 person, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I've also seen the flip side where you're basically being abused by the person who's like, you need to love your neighbors yourself. So
and I'm your neighbor.
And I'm your neighbor.
And I could use that right now.
So you almost feel like the scriptures are being used against you to get them what they want,
And so you have to look at it as you love your neighbor like yourself. You take care of yourself. You make sure you eat 3 meals. You make sure that you're getting enough rest at night. You make sure, because you want to work on a fully recharged battery. And then you're able to be very helpful to whoever and whatever you're doing. But if you're not loving yourself and you're not making sure you're eating, taking in enough liquids and other things that you do to take care of yourself, you're not really going to be any good for anybody else either.
You know what, too? We recently had some friends we were talking to, visiting, and I love what he said. He said, when you're saying yes to someone, a lot of times you're saying no to someone else.
Yes.
Shout out, Mark. That was a really great statement. I loved that because it's true that, especially as a mom, I felt that way. It's like, if I say yes, that I'm going to help this person with this, this, and this, what is it going to cost my family or my children?
Mm-hmm. And because we are responsible for our children, we have to make sure that we're always alert as to what they need and provide the structure for them.
Right. Well, and that's even, ministry in the church. We want to love others well. We want to love our neighbor as ourselves, but we also want to be cognizant of the fact that there's only 24 hours in a day. And as much as we think that 24 hours could be completely used by us, it's not. There's something called sleep in there. There's something called rest in there. And we have to set those boundaries so that we can love ourselves well, and not for the purpose of selfishness, but for the purpose of ministry and being able to pour out into other people's lives.
And it was really interesting. Charlie Kirk's new book, all about the Sabbath, God set the boundary with us that we need to have time to rest, to focus on Him, to recharge in Him, and setting time aside where you kind of shut the world out is a really good idea. So God set that boundary with us. God worked 6 days and He rested on the seventh. He set the boundary that we work 6 days and we work hard on those 6 days, but we do take a day off and focus on our relationship with Him, our relationship with families, and doing these positive things, and so that we remain healthy.
Yeah, and we can serve.
Yes.
Yeah, so good. Well, thank you so much for joining us on today's podcast. We drop a podcast every Wednesday. Please like, subscribe, and review. Until next time, be blessed.
Thank you for listening to the Restore Go podcast. Now, Restore Go is produced by Pete Thompson Christian Counseling. Pete is a licensed therapist who offers affordable family and individual counseling in North Texas and online throughout the United States. Pete provides counseling from a biblical perspective. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast and visit us at PeteThompson.org.